The lead pastor at a historic church in downtown Minneapolis could be ousted, along with his entire congregation, because of their support of the LGBTQ community. Fox 9's Karen Scullin reports.
This is the First Covenant Church. It's part of the Evangelical Covenant Church, and it's been here since 1874. Although there have been some disagreements between First Covenant and the ECC over the years, in 2018, First Covenant put out a Love All statement. It included the welcoming of the LGBTQ community as members in ministry, in staff, and leadership roles. A month later, the pastor, Dan Collison, had his ministerial credentials suspended. The church was notified it was out of harmony with ECC's position on human sexuality. Now, in Nebraska, at ECC's annual meeting, delegates will decide whether Pastor Dan Collison will lose his ministerial credentials altogether, and if the First Covenant Church will be involuntarily dismissed from the Evangelical Covenant Church, something that reportedly hasn't happened in 130 years of the ECC. As of late today, we learned it will be on Friday that those two big issues will be decided. Now, in speaking with church leaders today, if the congregation is dismissed, nothing will really change. The church building and the congregation will stay and move forward. It's a very successful congregation. In fact, we're told they're not really fighting to stay with ECC. They just think what delegates are doing is wrong, and that other churches in the ECC are likely facing the same challenges that they are. So they see their effort to stay as benefiting other churches as well. But back to voting in Omaha, it's a lot of waiting at this point, again with those two big decisions expected on Friday. In Minneapolis, Karen Scullin, Fox 9.
Minneapolis church and its pastor have been voted out of their denomination over disagreements on same-sex marriage. Members of the Evangelical Covenant Church voted out First Covenant Church and Pastor Dan Collison today at their annual meeting in Omaha. Todd Wilson is here, and Todd, this isn't going over well with some members.
No, 75% of the executive board voted to remove the church and its congregation, and a bit later they voted to remove its pastor. I spoke with a member about the decisions, and she said it was a shame.
They want us to be as they are. We can't do that if the door's open.
Teresa Kidd is furious that the Evangelical Covenant Church has voted to expel the pastor of the First Covenant Church and its entire congregation.
They didn't want him to preach or do anything because supposedly we were out of harmony.
At the denomination's annual meeting Friday in Omaha, Nebraska, their executive board voted to involuntarily remove First Covenant Church of Minneapolis from the roster of covenant churches. In a statement, the ECC says clergy must refrain from same-sex weddings, congregations must refrain from hosting same-sex weddings and related events, and the board has authority to credential a pastor.
They had already came and stripped our pastor of his credentials. But we own our church, we own the name of First Covenant, and we have a wonderful board that voted him back in.
Previously, First Covenant stated it would treat LGBTQ members as equals and would be open to having same-sex marriages. On their Facebook page, they posted a message. It reads in part, "We are deeply grieved as we find ourselves cast out by a denomination that has historically been able to hold differences and find a middle way." Kidd says the decision is a big mistake.
But that's okay because, you know, we're going to be just fine. We love each other, we worship together, we cry together, we pray together, and we sail on together.
Well, Pastor Collins will be back at the pulpit Sunday to preach. He says he'll give a 10-minute update to members on what went on in Omaha.
Tonight we start with an update on a story we've been following for a couple of weeks. First Covenant Church in Minneapolis, a founding member of the Evangelical Covenant Church denomination, has been voted out of that denomination. First Covenant Church did not want to leave the denomination. It was involuntarily removed this afternoon by the denomination. What's the reason? The denomination says First Covenant was out of harmony for a few reasons. The main ones being because First Covenant says it would permit same-sex marriages and because it would permit clergy to officiate same-sex weddings.
And ultimately, our position all along is that we acknowledge your statement as the general ethos of the denomination, and we also ask for freedom to minister to those within our context in the way that we feel is faithful.
That request for freedom denied. out today. That man, Pastor Dan Collison, also had his covenant credentials removed this afternoon. So in the denomination's eyes, Dan's out too. The main body, the Evangelical Covenant Church, said this was a painful decision to remove First Covenant and said of the vote today, quote, they took an extremely painful but courageous step to uphold the ECC's communally discerned position on human sexuality and pastoral credentialing, end quote. Moving forward, First Covenant is free to continue operating its church in downtown Minneapolis. And now, just because Pastor Dan isn't a credentialed pastor by the ECC, he's still going to be the pastor at First Covenant. In fact, he said this afternoon he will be in church with his congregation on Sunday.